Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 178. This week the questions are taken from Guide 230 on SMS Lutzow and the Wednesday video on what would have happened if Task Force 34 had been there at the Battle of Samar. Chris Cook asks, I was wondering about the sounds of battle and how through different eras the sounds of battle would have changed to the ordinary sailor during a fight. Well, interestingly enough, sounds of battle for sailors would have gradually got louder and more terrifying, but then, at least for the up to the era that we finished talking about in the 1950s, actually dropped off quite significantly for the majority of the crew towards the 20th century. So obviously, when you're talking about a medieval battle before cannon are deployed aboard ships, it's effectively the same sounds as a medieval battle, only with occasional more splashing and a bit more wood splintering. Now, pretty much all the crew is going to be exposed to that, in large part just because the ship isn't big enough for you to be away from it. But, you know, it's the clash of arms. Then you start to get cannon aboard ships, and obviously the cannon are quite loud, and that is still going to be experienced by the majority of the crew because, again, the ships are not tremendously large. Maybe one or two people down in the hold of some of the larger ships might be somewhat insulated from it, but by and large what you're going to mostly be hearing is orders and cannon fire. And this goes through sort of the Tudor period, ships like the Mary Rose, into the early Stuart period, and then you enter the classic age of sail. And even then, during most of the time, you think about it, well, the upper decks of the ship will have guns, the main gun deck will have guns, and the only people who aren't going to be on one of those two areas fighting things out are going to be either people up in the masts and yards who then have, you know, a grand view of what's going on and not a lot of sound insulation. So again, the experience is going to be a lot of gunfire, as in cannon fire. Albeit that by the time we get to the classic age of sail, at least the larger ships of the line have become big enough that, you know, you might have surgeons and you've got deep magazines and things, and they're all going to be below the waterline. So whilst for the majority of the crew it's still going to be a lot of screaming and cannons going off, a small portion of the crew are going to experience the battle mostly as a series of thumps and distant screams from above. Then you get into the age of ironclads, and now this is where you start to get significant sections of the crew that are actually disconnected from the sounds of battle, because although the guns have gotten bigger and more powerful and therefore individually louder, the number of guns is also now dropping, and as you go into the 1870s, the rate of fire is also dropping off quite considerably. So, you know, aboard something like HMS Victory, where in the heat of battle you might have, if it's been doubled or if it's going between two different ships, you might have 100+ guns going off once every minute or two. If you're on something like HMS Devastation in 1870, there'll be at most 4 guns going off every few minutes, albeit those guns are quite large, but if you are down in the engineering sections, you're probably not going to notice too much. You'll still hear it. Devastation is not the world's largest ship, but the majority of the crew are going to be away from those guns firing, and thus mostly somewhat insulated from the effects, unless, of course, you know, you get hit. Then you're going to hear quite a bit. And this trend continues as ships get larger and larger until by the time you get to the age of dreadnoughts in World War I and then World War II, despite the fact that the guns are now, you know, massively powerful, they're as powerful as they're ever going to get, and obviously also very loud, if you happen to be several hundred feet and several decks away below the waterline in the engine room, or forward in a damage control position, or possibly in a fire control plotting position, or any number of other places, you now get to the experience where in a straight-up gunfight between battleships, or even cruisers, the noise of battle for the most part of the crew is going to be a series of dull thuds coming through the ship from elsewhere, and again, unless of course you are hit. And then right towards the end, it kind of escalates back up again for a certain portion of the crew because, whilst in World War One, pretty much the only people who are going to experience what it actually sounds like to fire a full broadside are going to be the spotters, the bridge crew, and maybe one or two people in the turrets. Because even then, you're behind a lot of armour. You'll know what it feels for your turret to fire. But if you're in the forwardmost turret, you're probably not even going to register that the aftmost turret has fired. But then come World War II, when air attack becomes a thing, suddenly volume will go back up again for a good chunk of the crew, because now there's going to be a good chunk of people, at least when air attacks are happening, out manning the anti-aircraft weapons. And so they're going to be out in the open. They're going to have dozens, if not hundreds, of gun barrels going off all around them, plus aircraft screaming out of the sky, explosions, etc., etc. So all of a sudden the noise level has ramped up again quite significantly. Obviously, depending on where you're stationed. If you're down in the turbine room, even if you're under air attack, at best you're going to hear distant rattles and thuds and not much else. Andre Silva asks, I read that in the London Naval Treaty, the Royal Navy proposed to build 12-inch armed light battleships. Why? And what could be their job if both the Royal Navy and US Navy had built a pair? Essentially, the 12-inch battleship proposal came about due to a mixture of thinking between a few high-ranking officers in the Royal Navy and a bunch of politicians who combined into this weird Gestalt belief where some of them actually genuinely believed the world wanted to disarm, which, shall we say, was somewhat naive of them, and others who didn't particularly care whether the world wanted to disarm or not, but did care about reducing budgets and naval expenditure. And they saw limiting displacement and guns even further than 35,000 tons and 16-inch guns as per the Washington Treaty was a way to do that. And there were other officers in the Royal Navy who were pushing back against it, but a combination of high ranks and politicians on their side meant that a lot of 12-inch battleship designs were considered. The 12-inch gun was seen as basically the smallest gun that could realistically be mounted that would still allow a battleship a decisive superiority over a heavy cruiser. Some of the slightly more extreme officers even were asking, can we get a battleship with 10 or 11-inch guns, until it was pointed out that at that point two 8-inch heavy cruisers could probably deal with them, which meant that heavy cruisers now became almost on a par with battleships and would throw everything out. So you had these 12-inch designs, and the general gist of it was that if everybody could only replace their old battleships with new 12-inch vessels, then it would be fine. And in the interim, you could design a 12-inch battleship to withstand 15 or 16-inch gunfire until it could get down to range and still save weight. So they were looking at a reasonably swift 12-inch battleship design in one instance, for example, as 29,000 tons, but armoured to withstand 15 and 16-inch gunfire down to a range where its own guns could be somewhat effective. And this kind of overlooked the fact that the most powerful battleships, i.e. things like the Tennessees, the Colorados, the Nagatos, and Britain's own Queen Elizabeth and Nelson and Revenge classes, would be the last that got replaced. And so the problem of these ships, the new proposed 12-inch ships being massively outgunned, would persist for 10 or so years at least. But I say some of these slightly misguided people were prepared to try and hope that that would be absolutely fine. And of course, the fact that the more sane were pointing out, well, the other governments probably won't agree with a measure that you're effectively bringing in because you like economy. Also, there are a bunch of nations out there who haven't signed up to the Washington Treaty, who, if you now choose to basically restrict the big navies to 12-inch gun ships, legitimately could build ships that are significantly superior to our own. At that point, someone like Russia, who hasn't signed up to the treaty system, as soon as they sort their communism induced revolutionary fervour out, where they're executing officers left, right and centre, and actually get the ship design back on track. You know, they were designing 14-inch battlecruisers back in World War One. They could easily come up with something that will smash aside a 12-inch armed ship. And fortunately for everybody concerned, the Americans stepped in and just said, no, we will never agree to this. One of the main reasons that the US Navy opposed it wasn't so much economy or anything like that. It was the fact that they'd realised that a 12-inch ship, even with heavy armour, is going to be significantly smaller, and they were beginning to get increasingly worried about whether or not you could fit a decent anti-aircraft battery on a smaller hull, given the priority target that it would represent. And so they didn't want to go any lower than 14-inch, which turned out in the end to be what was be agreed later on in the naval treaty negotiations. But this whole thing kind of, the 12-inch phase lasted from about 1926 up to the very early 1930s. Although at the same time there were other officers who managed to get their word in edgeways, and 14 and 16-inch ships were designed at the same time. Whiskey Delta Golf asks, early in the video, this is about Samar, you mentioned the possibility of surviving cruisers and destroyers being in a position to cross the T of the battleship line. How effective would a cruiser and destroyer force crossing the T of a line of otherwise engaged battleships be? Can they score effective torpedo hits from this angle? And what countermeasures could the battleships take, if any, since turning away would presumably not be an option if torpedoes are coming from ahead? So in the scenario where cruisers and destroyers are going across the front of a pre-engaged battleship line, they have a number of advantages. The battleships, in theory, have got all their guns pointed at the enemy battleships, so thus not pointed at them, which is always good. Additionally, because they are going across the front, it means that the battleship's secondary guns, which might well be a considerable threat to destroyers and even a threat to a number of cruisers, are limited in the number of guns they can bring to bear, as opposed to if you go full on broadside, where the entire broadside of secondaries can be shot at you. And in exchange, obviously, because you're crossing the T, you can unload with all of your guns. Now, that might not sound too brilliant, given that it's cruisers and destroyers. But when you think about it, it means that the vast majority of hits that those shells are going to be landing, even if they are 8, 6, or 5 or 4-inch guns, are going to be on the bows of the enemy ship, which normally, by World War II at least, are either unprotected or not very well protected because of the all-or-nothing armour scheme, or they're going to hit the bridge and the other surrounding superstructure. Admittedly, an 8-inch shell against maybe the side armour of a turret might stand a small chance, but I wouldn't really count on it. The main thing is that riddling the front of battleship, whilst it might not do killing damage, is going to slow it down and affect its manoeuvrability, which is going to help out the main battle line. And of course, the fact that you're smashing up the foremast and the bridge and all the associated people in there, needless to say, is going to rather deplete the command and control capabilities of most warships. And then when it comes to torpedoes, because you're coming in across the front of the ships, you don't have to launch your torpedoes right down their throat, at a 90-degree angle. You can launch a spread of torpedoes as you're coming in at, let's say, a 20 or 30-degree angle. And if you're lucky enough to have multiple torpedo mounts, such as on most destroyers, then you could, I suppose, fire 1 or 2 torpedoes straight at them as you go past, but also you can fire more torpedoes at a similar angle once you've gone past, and the torpedoes then are coming in from a 20-30 degree angle on the other side. That's a little bit more risky, because a torpedo that misses might then, depending on the ranges involved, carry on towards your own battle line, which isn't necessarily a good thing. But it puts the enemy battle line in a number of difficult positions, because, as I say, they can't really engage you very effectively with their own guns, be they primary or secondary. You're mainly going to be smashing up their primary command and control facilities and their unprotected or weakly protected bows, which is going to affect their viability as battle line units, and those incoming torpedoes, as you mentioned, are going to be very difficult to dodge. Because especially if you've launched at, say, a 20-30 degree angle as you're coming in to cross the T, what can those battleships do? If they turn away from them, they're actually exposing more of their broadside to the incoming torpedo spread, which, probably not going to end well. If they keep going and your aim is correct, you're going to get some nice hits on them, which is going to, again, not go very well for them. The only really viable strategy they have at that point is to turn towards those torpedoes, which actually means then turning to close the range on your own battle line, and presumably the fact that they're maintaining a certain range is a range they want to keep, so you're forcing them to step into a range that they don't want to be at, and because they're the ones who are doing the manoeuvring, correcting their own fire control solutions becomes more difficult, because they've now got to account for their own movements, which, dodging torpedoes might be changing quite often, plus the relative change of bearing of the enemy fleet, whereas their enemy fleet, i.e. your fleet, can just sit there and go, he's changing direction. That's cute. Drop range by 400 yards and fire again. And of course, if you anticipate them doing that, and again, if you have either multiple launchers or you've kept a few torpedoes back in your single launcher, perhaps if you're a cruiser, although not obviously a US cruiser, then you can fire another spread of torpedoes towards where you predict they're going to dodge. So a battleship that's under light and medium gunfire from one direction, heavy gunfire from another, and by the time they arrive, torpedoes from a third, is not in a very good place. Edward Dunn asks, during the age of steam and steel, was there a common practice or procedure for engaging a smaller number of enemy ships with more of your own, or vice versa? Would this be the same in battleships as it is in smaller ships? There wasn't a specific common practice or procedure, because it would vary not just across navies, but even across admirals and across situations. I mean, for example, if you, let's say, were leading a dozen destroyers and you came across 3 of the enemies, so you outnumber them 4-1 with fast ships, well, that kind of action is going to be a significantly different action to, say, if, like at Jutland, where you only have the advantage of 1 or 2 ships, thanks to some poor signalling, and you're leading big capital units, and so on and so forth. So in the first example, where you've got a massive numbers advantage, you might well order either an attack by divisions, an attack by squadrons, or an attack by a unit division, or just a general attack, working on the basis of statistics and hoping that everybody will hit all of the enemy just because there's so many random targets being picked. Whereas if you look at the situation where you slightly outnumber your enemy, then there tends to be some, especially by the early 20th century, commonly accepted tactics. The most commonly accepted one is that you should try and focus on the lead enemy vessel, because if you can cripple or destroy it, then not only have you taken out an enemy ship, but you also force the disruption of the rest of the battle line, because they have to steer around it, which again will throw out their calculations, but yours should in theory remain okay. And this is what Beatty ostensibly is trying to do at Jutland, but fails to do. So the idea in that case was that the first and second ships in the line should focus on the lead German ship, and then every ship subsequently should fire, the next engaged vessel. So the third ship in the British line would engage the second German vessel, and so on and so forth. But, as I say, due to problems in communication, that didn't happen, and what you ended up with was the lead 2 British ships engaging the lead vessel, but then the third British ship, in the absence of any other clear orders, engaged the ship directly opposite, which of course was also third in line for the Germans, which meant that the second German vessel in line wasn't engaged at all and basically had free target practice. Paul Barthol asks, With such a long sinking time and torpedo boats in attendance, how many of Lutzow's crew were saved when she sank? In the actual sinking itself, only 6 men were lost, and those were 6 men who were trapped in compartments in the forward part of the ship, where effectively their compartments had stayed watertight, whilst other compartments around them had flooded to the point that there was no way to actually get to them. Other than that, everyone else who was aboard Lutzow at the time of her sinking was taken off by the destroyers, although obviously bear in mind that she had also lost just over 100 men killed and over 50 wounded in the battle that she'd fought in that had resulted in the damage, which was why she was sinking. So the vast majority of Lutzow's crew made it back, with the exception of the battle casualties, plus, I say, those 6 men who were trapped aboard. Loaded Loris asks, what was the biggest improvement of the Cleveland class over the Brooklyn class? It just looks like Cleveland traded some of its main armament for some extra secondary battery. There were a number of improvements that the Cleveland class offered over the Brooklyns. Part of it was because they could be built on slightly more displacement, but also they were designed with the latest and greatest fire control and sensors in mind. The Brooklyn class, whilst they did have decent fire control, were of an age well before radar, so you couldn't have designed the Brooklyns to be able to carry radar as well as everything else, whereas with the Clevelands you could. So their sensor systems and overall fire control suite was superior. It definitely in anti-aircraft engagements, anti-surface, apart from the radar, which could be retrofitted to the Brooklyns, to be fair, was broadly on a par. The protection, although in terms of on-paper numbers, doesn't change too much between the Brooklyns and the Clevelands, but in terms of distribution and effectiveness, it is better on the Clevelands. But the biggest improvement is, as you mentioned, the secondary battery. However, it can't quite be overstated how much of an improvement this was. The Brooklyns have 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns, for most of them anyway, and they're arranged in 4 single mounts per side. So you have a broadside of heavy anti-aircraft firepower of 4 guns. And they're the 25 caliber version of the 5-inch gun, which is a pretty good AA gun, don't get me wrong. But the 5-inch 38, which is what the Clevelands introduced, has superior range. It also has a dual-purpose role in anti-ship work, which does help when you're facing off against things like Japanese destroyers, and also for things like shore bombardment, although that is very much a secondary concern at the time that they're being built. But apart from just being individually a better gun, the 5-inch 38 comes in a mount that near enough as makes no difference is almost a turret, so it's got better protection for the gun crews as well. And although you are also increasing the barrel count from 8 to 12, you're increasing the effective barrel count far more on a Cleveland, because in order to save weight for the fire control systems, as well as the upgraded anti-aircraft firepower, they're dropping the third turret. So the Clevelands go from 15 6-inch guns to 12 6-inch guns. But with some of the space that's saved, as you'll see, they stick the 2 additional sets of 5-inch guns fore and aft instead of on the wings. So you have a 50% increase in anti-aircraft firepower in terms of heavy AA gun barrels, but you actually double the effective broadside, so 200% increase, because those fore and aft mounts can obviously train port or starboard. So if you're under attack from a given direction, the ship can train 8 guns out instead of the Brooklyn's 4, plus all the other advantages I mentioned earlier. So that gives the Clevelands considerably more survivability in the face of attack of anything that's not a surface-based vessel, and against most surface-based vessels that aren't significantly heavily armoured, i.e. the better heavy cruisers and battleships and such like. The Clevelands arguably have a slightly superior broadside, because don't get me wrong, the Brooklyns 15 guns do an awful lot of damage to a lot of things, but the Clevelands are not too far behind them with the main battery, but they can also throw 8 5-inch guns into the mix, which Okay, fair enough. If you're fighting a large light cruiser or a heavy cruiser, may or may not be a massive game changer, but trust me, when you're fighting some of the lighter light cruisers, or you're going up against destroyers, it can make a huge difference, especially if you have to engage multiple targets at once. Captain Seafort asks, in a recent Drydock you discussed the effects on Jutland if British shells had actually worked as advertised. What do you think the effects would have been if Lion hadn't hit Seydlitz's aft barbette at Dogger Bank? As I understand it, German ammunition handling at the start of the war was almost as bad as the battlecruiser fleet at Jutland, until Seydlitz's very close call prompted changes. Without that prompt, it seems likely that those early handling practices would have remained, and hits on German turrets and barbettes at Jutland, such as Queen Mary's hit on Seydlitz's sea barbette at the start of the run to the south, could have had the same results as those on the battlecruiser fleet. How many similar hits do you think could have caused problems under the previous ammunition handling arrangements? And obviously, what would the knock-on effects have been in the battle? It's true, there were a number of procedures that were changed in the High Seas Fleet in the aftermath of the nearly catastrophic fire in Seydlitz at Dogger Bank. If that doesn't happen, now, it's difficult to say exactly if these procedures would still be exactly the same as they were at Dogger Bank at Jutland, because we know from the testimony of various officers at Jutland that even within the battlecruiser fleet, different ships were following somewhat different practices, because some gunnery officers were coming in or already standing there and horrified at some of the things that were being changed, and they in turn had enacted changes of their own. So if this hit at Dogger Bank didn't happen, it's possible that the risks inherent in existing practices may still have continued. It's possible that someone relatively high up the food chain may have had attention brought to them separately and changed something. It may also be that some officers, like in the battlecruiser fleet, recognised the problem and took steps, and others didn't. So all things are possible at that point. However, if we assume, for the sake of the question, that this kind of slightly looser practice is still common throughout the first scouting group by the time of Jutland, then I don't think it's going to save Indefatigable for a start, because Von der Tann hadn't actually been hit in any significant way at all by the time that Indefatigable explodes. Yeah, there is a hit, as you mentioned, that Queen Mary scores. That might save Queen Mary. So Queen Mary quite possibly survives because, catastrophic fire aboard the ship that's firing at her is going to reduce that ship's ability to fire back, probably going to make it manoeuvre somewhat. So the exact circumstances where the shell arrives aboard Queen Mary that causes her ultimate destruction have changed. With Invincible, it's somewhat more difficult. Lutzow herself doesn't receive any hits that could have compromised her in that way prior to the sinking of Invincible. So in theory, Invincible's duel with Lutzow should go pretty much the same way it does historically. But in the interim between the opening of the action and the duel between Invincible and Lutzow, a number of other German battlecruisers did sustain hits to their turrets and barbettes, and a number further still would go on to sustain them afterwards. So if some of the other German battlecruisers had suffered a Seydlitz-like fire or worse, thus affecting the tactical considerations of Hipper, and of course Queen Mary in theory possibly still being alive, again that may lead to a circumstance where the exact deployment that causes the Invincible Lutzow duel may no longer happen. Hipper may be forced to be playing it a bit more cautiously. And if he is, then, let's say that engagement may not happen exactly as it did in real life. So I would say of the three big battlecruiser losses that the British suffer, Queen Mary is at least reprieved from the hit that killed her, historically. Indefatigable's basically still dead. Invincible may or may not live, depending on exactly how things play out from the point where Queen Mary no longer explodes, and possibly one or two other German battlecruisers suffer some rather nasty fires before the Grand Fleet arrives. Contact Alias asks, Drac, I've noticed that on a lot of ship models, blueprints, schematics, etc., the propeller shafts appear to be at a slight downward angle. This not only applies to larger warships, but also smaller civilian craft. Shouldn't the downward angle of the prop push the hull down into the water at the bow, reducing speed but possibly increasing stability? Why this design feature? For the most part, it's just a simple factor of ships' hulls and where the engines need to be positioned. Because bear in mind, if you're talking about the engine itself, the centre of rotation tends to be on or about the centre of the engine in vertical terms, which means that if you're going to have a perfectly straight propeller, then or propeller shaft, then that shaft is going to be already elevated somewhat above the deck of the lowest deck of the ship, not including the bilge. And on top of that, as I just mentioned, the deck of the ship that the engines are mounted on is not the lowest portion of the hull, so there's a reasonable amount of hull underneath that. So all of that height would have to be taken account for with a completely horizontal propeller shaft, which means it's actually going to exit out of the hull considerably higher up. Now, if it exits out of the hull higher up, well, obviously there's a propeller or screw attached to the end. That's going to go spinning round and round, which means you're going to have to start curving the hull of the stern up and out of the way of the propeller a lot sooner, which is going to reduce the buoyancy aft, it's going to reduce your capacity, etc., which is not necessarily a good thing. The alternative is you extend the propeller shaft a lot further, so it sticks further out the back of the ship, which has problems with maintaining the stability of the shaft, with increasing additional weight of the ship, and so forth, and the vulnerability of the props themselves. And you also have to take into account that when a propeller spins around, it displaces water. That's how it moves the ship forward. If that propeller is closer to the surface, then more of its energy is lost to just disturbing water on the surface, as opposed to actually shoving water backwards so that the ship can move forwards. And so you ideally want your propellers as deep as possible, reasonably speaking, and also the fact that if the propeller is higher up, then that means that water that's passing under the hull has to come up before it meets the propellers. Will have to come up further than it would do otherwise, and that's going to introduce all sorts of problems with turbulent flow, which is going to reduce the efficiency of your propellers. So effectively, you want your propellers as deep as is practicable on a hull, and you want the propeller shafts as short as possible, again within reasonable practical limits, on a hull. And the easiest way of doing that, when you consider a ship of any substantial size, is just to angle the prop shafts down somewhat, because then that means that they exit the hull further down than in vertical terms than they are starting at the point where they're connected to the engines. And by the time you reach the prop, which is obviously somewhat further out from the hull, the end of that shaft has dropped further still, which means the propeller is now nice and deep and receiving hopefully a mostly clear flow of water to it, so that it can move you around in the most efficient way possible. Truly Canadian asks, do you think Lutzow could have been saved if she was sailing in reverse? And in hindsight, do you know of any other ships that could have been saved by doing one thing or another differently? With Lutzow, by the time sailing her in reverse becomes an option, I'm not sure that would save her. It would probably keep her afloat longer, but there was a kind of a vanishing point past which the flooding began to effectively get back, circling back on itself, which was, as the weight of the water dragged the ship further down, that allowed water into more holes that had been higher up in the ship, And then eventually that would start to expose the propellers, which then obviously she couldn't move as fast, which then meant the flooding had more time to seal her fate, and so on and so forth. Granted, sailing forward and effectively forcing the water through the holes didn't help that. But once she's taken those waterline hits from Invincible, that's an awful lot of water. That flooding will progressively kill the ship. Sailing in reverse might slow the flooding down. But given where she sank and given the speed drop-off that was going on, I don't think she'd end up in a Seydlitz type situation where sort of grounds and then is dragged over the last few miles effectively by tugs and pumps and then sinks at home. Mainly because with Seydlitz, okay, she wasn't settling on an entirely even keel, but in terms of fore and aft, she was mostly still on a roughly even keel. Whereas with Lutzow, proportionally less water was required to bring her propellers both first into an inefficient position and then into a not really very helpful position at all, because the vast majority of Lutzow's flooding is all forward, and very little aft. In terms of other ships that could have been saved by doing something differently, it's a bit difficult for that, because they're on, at least in the age of steam and steel, there's most of the time when ships are sunk, they tend to be terminated with extreme prejudice over eventually. So, something like, well, you're not going to save Bismarck. That's just not going to happen. There's obvious ones, like if Admiral Cunningham wanted to take a little bit more of a risk, he could have saved Polar just by towing it away. But you have to look at sort of ships that were limping home, didn't make it quite on their own, where you can identify something that might be able to be changed. And of course, it's easy to argue, oh, well, if that ship had gone left instead of right, or this direction instead of that direction, or whatever, then it wouldn't have been hit in the first place. But I think that's a little bit too easy of a cop-out. I think you have to look at, in the spirit of your question, ships that have been already badly damaged. And one of the obvious ones is Prince of Wales. If they don't restart that propeller shaft, could they have saved her? Genuinely, I don't think so. Not because the flooding would have killed her anyway. If that propeller shaft hadn't been restarted and the flooding hadn't spread quite as catastrophically, then in principle you might have been able to save her. But in practice, if Prince of Wales is still manoeuvring and firing and, not in the obviously bedraggled state that she was, in which point they still hit her with torpedoes anyway, but if she's still a much more active threat, the Japanese torpedo bombers will just concentrate more on her and eventually, most likely, either hit her with enough torpedoes to put her down anyway, or send in follow-up strikes, which they were looking to see if it was necessary, but didn't, because both Prince of Wales and Repulse had already sunk. Weirdly enough, not restarting that propeller shaft might, however, have saved Repulse, because if you remember, Repulse only ended up going down because she was caught in a somewhat unintentional pincer movement by Japanese torpedo bombers. If Prince of Wales was still active and running around, then if some of those torpedo bombers are still going after her, then they may not have gone after Repulse. And if they don't go after Repulse and set up that pincer movement, there's every chance, given how Captain Tennant was handling his ship, that Repulse might have dodged all the torpedoes and gotten away. Probably would have had to stop to pick up Prince of Wales survivors, at which point it's going to come down to kind of a little bit of a swings and roundabouts. Basically, does Admiral Holland try and take as many of Prince of Wales' crew onto Repulse and obviously the escorting destroyers and get them all away, or does Admiral Holland tell Captain Tennant that saving Repulse is more important and sends Repulse racing off away before Japanese reinforcements can get there, and rely just on his destroyers to try and rescue the crew of Prince of Wales. But there is a slight possible scenario there where you might genuinely save the crew or save the repulse by Prince of Wales doing something different. And, there's a few other ones. To name one more example, Taiho, while she may or may not have been finished off later on, she at least wouldn't have catastrophically exploded and caught fire everywhere if some enterprising but misguided officer hadn't tried to open up all of the hatches and turn on all the ventilation, thus turning Taiho from a partial fuel air bomb into a complete fuel air bomb. Whether or not she would have survived the rest of the damage, as I say, it kind of swings around about, but she would have had a heck of a lot better chance if the fumes and any potential subsequent explosion was restricted to much less of the ship than actually occurred over. Robert Hedges asks, what type of training would deck officers given when transitioning to a new ship type? And there's obvious capability and handling differences between a destroyer and a cruiser, etc. But even within similar ship types, moving from class to class must have differences, i.e. moving from a North Carolina to an Iowa class would have similarities, but also certain differences. Was this done strictly as on-the-job training, where you just stand watch with a person experienced on that class for a while? Or were you expected to have the seamanship to make it work out? And what type of manuals would be studied before reporting to a new ship? For the time period that's covered by this channel, there's not a tremendous amount of pre-transfer training going on, unless you're moving to a completely, and I mean completely, different kind of ship. So if you're moving from regular surface vessels to carriers, or to submarines, or vice versa, that will entail some additional training, because, you're not going to stand watch on the deck of a submarine all the time. I mean, you might do if the sub's on the surface, but you probably don't want to report there when you're 300 foot under the Atlantic. But broadly, other than that, you might, if you're lucky, get a primer on the new type of ship you're being assigned to. Their sort of small guides to X-class ship did exist in some navies. But normally it would be a case of, well, here's your new ship. You should have skills commensurate to what we're asking you to do. You will be trained basically on the job by working with officers who already know what they're doing on this particular ship, and have fun. So you can see that when you look through the biographies of various admirals who obviously made it high up the ranks, particularly most recently the one I've read, it was a Battleship Commander about Admiral Lee. It refers to, for example, when he arrives aboard USS Concord, that one of the first things he ends up doing is, when the ship is out at sea, taking it around, manoeuvring it to get used to how quickly does it turn, how quickly does it respond to the helm, which are two different things, how fast does it accelerate, decelerate, etc. And this is obviously for navigation. And then you've got a reasonable idea of how well the ship will handle. You're not going to give a brand new transfer officer responsibility of bringing the ship into dock immediately, unless you are a little bit, possibly drop down the stairs at birth, because that's a very, very, very easy way to ruin a perfectly good ship, although that doesn't mean it doesn't happen occasionally. Nevertheless, the short answer is that the majority of training would be done by just working with officers who are already there, with the exception of very different weapons, or if you're, because I mean, your transfers implies you already have some skills from an existing ship. Obviously, if you are going into your first ship, you would get off-board training already. But for example, if you, worked on destroyers and the single biggest weapon you'd ever worked with was a hand-loaded 5-inch gun, and you were being transferred to a battleship with 16-inch guns, or later in World War II, perhaps an auto-loading Des Moines, then you might receive some training ashore in between transfers in order to make sure you're at least basically familiar with some of the larger issues that you're going to run into. These days, as far as I gather, it is a somewhat different issue, although there is still a lot of on-the-job training. Chris Gregory asks, how much was Beatty personally responsible for the removal of safety measures in the battlecruiser fleet to increase the rate of fire? Surely the captains and officers of the ships involved could, and perhaps should, have refused to compromise safety for a marginal, if any, increase in hitting power. Why didn't this happen, and how much blame apportions to Beatty personally as opposed to his subordinates? Well, that harks back to a question earlier in this very Drydock. The British fleet as a whole, the Royal Navy, did have something of an emphasis on rate of fire in the early part of the war. But it was exacerbated in the battlecruiser fleet, at least so it would seem, by the move down to Rosyth, or whatever, in the Firth of Forth, where they didn't have access to quite the same level of long-range gunnery training facilities as they had up in Scapa Flow, which left them with the occasional ability to exercise and a lot of practice loading and reloading. That was then exacerbated by Dogger Bank and Beatty getting into his idea that he needed to hit even more often. So it wasn't exclusively a battlecruiser fleet problem, but the circumstances of where the battlecruiser fleet found itself, plus Beatty, plus his command style, etc., kind of focused and enhanced this somewhat more within the battlecruiser fleet. And, you can lay a certain amount of responsibility on Beatty for things that he didn't do as well, because whilst he didn't have the kind of safe protected anchorage where you could do long-range gunnery exercises that you could with Scapa, he could have exercised out in more open waters for long-range gunnery practice more than he did. He chose not to. And he also, he knew roughly what his own fleet was doing, or at least when he bothered to talk to them, but didn't do anything to stop them. Now, as from the flip side, as I mentioned in the earlier question, there were officers who turned around and went, no, this is stupid, or this has gone too far, and we're going to change things. And one or two who just flat out refused to have anything to do with this nonsense in the first place. So you get different degrees of safety measures being ignored on different ships with different consequences. And of course you also have the issue that some ships just aren't hit in a position where they could actually have been exploded anyway, and other ships, well, their armour was never going to save them even if they had followed perfect protocols. I've said before, the Indefatigable class, the Invincible class to a certain degree, but actually the Indefatigable class are even worse for that. So it's not, it is on Beatty in a way, because he is the commander of the battlecruiser fleet, so ultimately these decisions do stop with him. But on the other hand, he is not, in a more practical sense, as opposed to a chain of command sense, he's not 100% totally to blame. Because, as you said, captains and certainly gunnery officers in certain ships should have picked up on this and should have, put a stop to it or made modifications, albeit, obviously, it's very easy to judge in hindsight. Isogen asks, I was recently reading Friedman's US Battleships, an illustrated design history, and one of the things he mentioned was that the US Navy ships had certain interesting hard constraints on their design. One such example was the masthead height being limited to 125 feet in order to clear the Brooklyn Bridge, as the bridge was in the way of access to New York Navy Yard. Did other navies, such as the British, German, Japanese, etc., face similar physical constraints with regards to ship or mast height? Not many. France obviously was not, because here's Richelieu being brought into New York Navy Yard, and as you can see, they've actually had to cut down some of her superstructure so that she can fit under the aforementioned bridge. So France definitely not suffering from that constraint. Japan also not really. Germany, again, not so much. Germany and Japan both benefiting in a lot of ways from the fact that their shipyards are, even compared to New York Navy Yard and the Brooklyn Bridge, relatively recent innovations, and so they can afford to be a little bit more open water about how they're doing things and where they're constructing bridges and such. The British are somewhat constrained at points. You've got the Forth Bridge, for example, the one up downriver from Rosyth, which does impose some height restrictions, albeit that, as you can see from something like, say, the modern Queen Elizabeth class carriers, the British did tend to come up with some rather inventive solutions to those kinds of things. The modern ship can actually lower the overheight portion of its superstructure in order to fit under the bridge, for example. But broadly speaking, most of those other navies faced restrictions that weren't really to do with mast height. It was more to do with draft or size of dry docks than an offending piece of bridge infrastructure. Edward Franklin Woods asks, it takes a brave captain to override a visiting admiral. How many captains have done this, and what are their stories? I'm not sure if this is just an artifact of some of the more exceptional officers, but let's face it, it tends to be the most exceptional officers who tend to get the most written about them. But when I've been looking through biographies of various admirals, including King, Lee, Cunningham, Hawke, if you go back far enough in the Royal Navy's history, for example, they all seem to have incidences of this from both ends. So back when they are captains, there's usually at least one, possibly more stories about an admiral aboard their ship overstepping their mark somewhat, and the officer in question telling them, no, that's not how things are going to happen around here. And that's usually down to things such as an admiral trying to give specific navigating instructions on a ship. Now, an admiral, especially in the older time periods, could definitely direct how he wanted the ship fought. So he could say, if we're taking Age of Sail example, close with the enemy ships over there, or haul the line over in this direction, or attack from leeward or windward, or something like that. That's fine. That's within the purview of the admiral's authority. But how exactly he gets there is down to the captain and his crew. So, for example, at Trafalgar, the crew of Victory offered Nelson the choice of, do you want us to pass fore or aft of the Bucentaur? Nelson, in that case, basically said, do what you like, and they chose to pass astern. But even if Nelson had been a bit more decisive in his decision and said, I specifically want you to pass by the stern, he would have said something along the lines of, take me past the stern of the French flagship, not adjust your course 3 points to starboard and then 1 point to port and dress sails and all of this kind of stuff, because that's what the captain does. And usually it's when an admiral ends up doing that and either tries to countermand specific navigation instructions or tries to do them himself, that's when the various captains that I mentioned tend to turn around and say, no, I'm doing this. This is not your realm at this point. And occasionally, to be granted, to be fair, most of them, not all, but most of them do also seem to have stories about occasionally having accidentally done this when they themselves were then admirals, and having to be reminded by their captains that actually, no, you need to back off a little bit. And to their credit, for the most part, they are usually fairly apologetic about that. And sorry, my bad, that won't happen again. Please carry on as you are. But as I say, whether or not this is therefore indicating that it happens not infrequently across navies, or whether this is just an artifact of the most exceptional officers will usually be the ones with the spine to stand up to the admiral, and may also therefore as admirals be occasionally forgetting their place and being a bit more overbearing on their captains, I don't know. Samuel asks, why did the US not invest in rebuilding older capital ships during the interwar period like most other navies? Surely the Colorados would have been worth modernising at least somewhat. So this is similar to a question from a relatively recent Drydock But to expand on it a bit more, the US was planning a modernisation program for its capital ships, but it was running at a slightly different tempo to everybody else's for two primary reasons. One was that, simply put, they didn't have the pressing need that the Italians did, because the Italians had relatively few capital ships. And when compared to the other big navies, they didn't actually have ships that they considered to be as useful in the era of the fast battleship. Because when you look at what did the Royal Navy modernise first? Renown and 3 Queen Elizabeths. They planned to do so the other Renown, Repulse and Hood, etc. But they started off with some of their faster units. They weren't going to modernise the Revenges. The Revenges were going to be replaced. And the Japanese, yes, they updated pretty much their whole fleet, but the ones that went in for the biggest modernisations were the Congos, which again were the fastest. The Japanese didn't pay too much attention to the Fusos and the Iseis, which were considerably slower, and all the US standard class were, by the standards of the mid-1930s, pretty slow. So without the need of, we absolutely have to modernise battleships that the Italians had, and without the fast ships to select as an easy starter, the US had a bit of a drag in that sense. Plus, they were still somewhat constrained for money at the time, in the early to mid-1930s, and they were trying to get other programs off the ground at the same time. Bearing in mind that the Royal Navy had built Ark Royal, then started in on the modernisations, then started in on, well, as well as new capital ships, on the next generation of aircraft carriers, whereas in the US Navy, the Yorktowns were being built roughly contemporaneously with when most other people were beginning to modernise their capital ships, so money only goes so far. Now, with that all said, the US was still planning on modernising ships. As I mentioned in my previous response to that kind of question a few weeks ago, that's why Colorado wasn't at Pearl Harbor. She was in dock in the continental United States preparing for a modernisation. And the US's plan was to modernise the Colorados and the Tennessees. And by the time that had finished, they would have drawn down on Texas, New York, Nevada, and Oklahoma as the North Carolinas and the first South Dakotas came online, and effectively been working their way down the standards, starting with the Colorados, as they worked their way up in terms of retirement and replacement, with newer fast battleships meeting at some point somewhere in the middle. Richard Goss asks, gaming the Washington Naval Treaty, could the Royal Navy have pulled a similar trick as the Japanese, converting a couple of 13.5-inch battlecruisers into Royal Yachts, fast troop transports or something to that effect, keep all their turrets stored away, and thus Lion, Queen Mary and Tiger are in a position to be recommissioned when the treaties collapse? Are they still viable, perhaps as a squadron? I mean, strictly speaking, there's nothing that prevents them from doing so with one of the ships, but to do so with more than one becomes exponentially more difficult and less useful, because what the treaty allowed for was training ships, but usually just the one. So for the US, that was USS Utah, the Japanese declared Hiei, and the British declared Iron Duke, which was still around for the entirety of World War II, even if the Luftwaffe did pretty much sink it relatively early on. But regardless, there wasn't scope within the treaty to have lots of those ships, and if you were converting a battlecruiser to a fast troop transport or something like that, something that's not just a training vessel like Hiei, then you'd have to do an awful lot more work to it to convince everybody that it is completely and totally not armed, or armed to the level that a yacht or transport should be. So you'd be talking about completely stripping out all the turrets, but they'd probably expect you to put sort of accommodation blocks on there, maybe pull out the magazines or the barbettes or something. Because why would you keep the barbettes and the magazines in a transport, you'd surely want more space, wouldn't you? So I think for those kinds of conversions, you'd have to do so much work that it would be long and slow and costly to actually convert them back, and thus there's no point in doing so. But whilst that is the case, I think you might be able to make a case for turning Tiger into a training ship. So Iron Duke became a training ship, but then when Tiger's retired, you could put, I think you could put a decent case together of saying, oh no, Tiger is now our training vessel, disarming as necessary. The biggest problem is going to be because Japan knew what was going to happen. They could pull Hiei out of semi-retirement and modernize and rebuild her before the war started. Whereas for the Royal Navy, even if they intended that kind of trick, they weren't expecting war in 1939, so they'd be putting Tiger back together and recommissioning her during the early part of the war. And during the early part of the war, that would have been when she was most useful, chasing off after Panzerschiff, because she's basically perfectly built to hunt and kill them. But you're not going to get... No, I don't think anyone's going to fall for, we converted a whole squadron of battlecruisers into not warships. And also, the older ones, Lion, Princess Royal, are far less useful. They're slower, they're smaller, they're not as capable, they're more worn out. Tiger would have to go through an extensive modernization in the late 1920s in order to not have to go through an absolutely massive modernization when she's brought back into service, and she'd still need a refit, just not necessarily as much of one. So, possible, but given the circumstances of the Second World War, probably not tremendously useful, because by the time Tiger is back up and running, the surface raids that you'd probably be using her against have largely gone away. I suppose you could use her as a kind of an Arctic convoy escort flagship, because she'd more than happily face off against a Hipper or a Deutschland, but you'd still have to worry about, Tirpitz or even Scharnhorst coming out. And without some relatively significant improvements to her armour scheme, I don't necessarily think you'd even want her in the Mediterranean. I mean, as a fast vessel, she'd be quite happy running around, actually keeping up with Warspite quite comfortably, but with her relative paucity of armour, you'd end up using her as effectively a giant supercruiser more than a ship to throw down with even the refitted Cavors, unless, of course, as I say, somehow the Royal Navy anticipates everything and maybe starts bringing her back into service in early 1938, together with armour upgrades, engine upgrades, etc., etc. And that brings us to the end of this particular dry dock, and indeed the end of dry docks that will be uploaded in 2021, albeit that technically speaking the December Patreon dry dock is still to go, but thanks to the vagaries of calendars, it means it's actually going to go live in the first couple of days of January, but there you go, can't have everything. In any case, I'm looking forward to the America trip next year, and a few other trips I have booked in. A few videos that people have been asking for a long time will hopefully be coming out, and generally I think you're all going to enjoy the channel even more in 2022 than you did in 2021, hopefully. Well, if you don't, that means I'm not doing my job properly, so never mind. We'll just have to see how it all works out. See you later.